All right. We're getting a steady stream of people coming in. Amazing. So while we wait for other people to come in, I will just get us started. So welcome and thank you all for joining us for our third webinar in our Global Science Policy webinar series. Today, we will be covering skills for science, science diplomacy, and this webinar is being recorded and we'll be sending you a follow-up email within the next day or so with some information on how to rewatch it. And we have an amazing panel today, so I'll go ahead and get us started. So our agenda today is as follows. So right now we're in the welcome, but next we'll have our panelists doing their own introductions. So for roughly the first half hour, our panelists will each introduce themselves, explain what science diplomacy means to them, tell you a little bit about their career trajectories and how they got into science diplomacy, and offer some insights on the skills and paths that other scientists can take to get into science diplomacy. And then we will leave roughly half of the webinar for your questions. So please drop any questions in the Q&A box as our panelists are presenting, and we'll be sure to answer them all at the end during our Q&A session. We will also have an upvoting feature. So if you see a question that you also wanted to ask, you can also upvote that so we can prioritize them if we start to run out of time. And on the American Geophysical Union side, this webinar is being led and moderated by members of the AGU Science Policy and Government Relations team. So my name is Sophie Mangusarian, and I'm the Senior Specialist of Grassroots Engagement on the Science Policy team. And I'm joined by Lexi Schultz, the Vice President of the Science Policy and Government Relations team. And with that, I'll get to the exciting part and introduce the speakers for today's webinar. So joining us today are Dr. Brian Lung, Dr. Luz Comba Garcia, and Dr. Bernat Serrer. They will be each introducing themselves in more detail next. But Luz brought slides, so Luz, you will go first, then I'll stop sharing and we'll turn it over to Brian and Bernat in that order. So Luz, whenever you're ready, just let me know when you want me to advance your slides.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luz Comba Garcia. I'm originally from Puerto Rico. I'm currently a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. Department of State in the Office of Mexican Affairs. Next slide, please. My journey was very diverse, as my colleagues Brian and Bernat. I'm an immunologist by training. I started my bachelor's degree back in 2008, many years ago, at Universidad Metropolitana. My major is cellular and molecular biology. During that time, I had the opportunity of conducting research abroad in places like Germany, Brazil, Spain, and also being a professor abroad. Later, I did my master's degree in immunology at the University of Granada in Granada, Spain, as well as my PhD at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, in immunology as well. I started as a fellow back in 2022. Next year, by January, will be the end of my fellowship. The first year of my fellowship was at USAID with the Bureau for the Middle East, and the second year is now at the U.S. Department of State. Next slide. I think all these different experiences had led me to become a science communicator is something that I'm very passionate about, and also a science diplomacy advocate. And I really enjoy doing this type of activities, outreach activities, talking to other scientists, to other students, and hopefully inspiring the next generation to join policy and diplomacy. Next slide, please. So very brief, what I think about science diplomacy, I think about building bridges through international scientific cooperation. And I really like this graph because it shows how the academia and policy overlap and how we can build bridges, basically. How can we prepare scientists for diplomacy, for policy, teaching skills that are relevant, applying research to policy processes, and understanding the societal engagement and impact of these policies as well, and the science. And in the policy side, we have how to communicate with policymakers. That's a skill that I think is a duty from us scientists to learn, right? As well as to communicate with the public, with the taxpayers that are funding the research that we're conducting. And how we can produce evidence-informed policies that can help us advance and contribute to the greater society, of course. Next slide. I really like this graph because it shows 12 ways to prepare for a science policy career. Next slide, please. And although I do a little bit of everything, can you click? No, go back. It's not, there's an animation there.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure why those aren't showing up for here, but I will try to fix that.
Okay, don't worry. So I'm doing a little bit of all these things to prepare for a science or I did a lot of these things to prepare for a science policy career. I wanted to highlight especially enrolling in fellowships, joining professional societies, engaging with university government relations firms and departments, and leading and founding extracurriculars, and also engaging in science outreach and communication. While everything is important, I focus my career on these things. Next slide. And speaking of fellowships, enrolling in fellowships, like I mentioned, I'm part of the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. I recently finished my journey as a STEP Fellow. That stands for Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research, or IAI, Science, Technology, and Policy STEP Fellow. This program is homologous to the AAAS, but it has a focus on Latin America and the Caribbean, but it's more or less like the same, an opportunity for scientists to become more involved in policy and diplomacy in the Americas. Next slide. And as a AAAS fellow, as previously mentioned, my first year was at USA, working with the Middle East Regional Cooperation Program, or MERC, which is a program that supports scientific research cooperation between Israel and the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. My role as a fellow was promoting new partnerships, reviewing scientific proposals, advising interagency committees, and conducting outreach with research and partners. And this was like my first big girl job, right, with the government. Prior to that, I was a policy advisor for a government relations firm, but this was my first introduction to the government and the government processes. Next slide, please. And it was a great experience. Here are some pictures. Of course, traveling is one of my passions, and when you can combine your work with that is amazing. Something that I learned was navigating multicultural advocacy and diplomacy as a fellow. There is a concept that I really like that is intercultural communication, which is the capacity to communicate with people from diverse cultures. And there is a lot of diplomacy there, right? You have to work on your language skills. And I'm not specifically talking about like English, Spanish, Arabic. I'm talking about the way you communicate with these people, because you come from different backgrounds, from different cultures, you have different religions. So you have to be very mindful of the ways of thinking, the social norms in that area, because you don't want to be disrespectful, right? So there is an ongoing process of exchanging messages based on the relationships history and individual experiences, how you relate with these people. And there is a component, diplomacy is influenced about all this, about interpersonal skills, personal relationships. And this was a great opportunity to learn about that concept. Next slide, please. And now, recently, in January of this year, I joined the Office of Mexican Affairs, that is within the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau at the U.S. Department of State. This office is in charge of conducting U.S. foreign policy towards Mexico and is leading participant in interagency processes. So in simple words, we deal with all the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. And this goes from migration issues, drugs, cartels, borders, security, you name it, everything under the sun. Since I'm a scientist, I'm in charge of everything related to environment, science, technology, and health. And I put health on bold because unfortunately it's a very small portfolio. I wish it was bigger, especially after the pandemic, but unfortunately that's the way it is. But yes, we facilitate US-Mexico policy making. I'm in charge of summarizing key technical information for policymakers, and it's been a great experience so far. In this picture, we are with the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Ambassador Salazar. Next slide. In others' experiences as a fellow, as a step fellow, because that was my like a soft fellowship appointment that I had under the AAAS, I had the privilege and the honor of working with Brian in this project, that he was working with limited healthcare access in rural Oaxaca and indigenous communities, Oaxaca in Mexico as well. And we were providing One Health recommendations for addressing non-economic losses and damages. Non-economic losses and damages are those consequences from climate change that cannot be measured, basically like a loss of life, loss of culture, like it cannot be monetary measure, in other words. So we had the opportunity of traveling to Guatemala. Those are the pictures that you're seeing there, to Antigua and Guatemala City, and presenting our project at the Universidad del Valle over there. And we also have the opportunity of publishing an article with Latinoamérica 21 and also participating in a compendium talking about the importance of One Health in these non-economic losses and damages. Next slide, please. Going to joining professional societies, I know a lot of people are trying to figure out how I become involved, right, on these processes, on policy. What can I do for policy and diplomacy? So this is just a teeny tiny sample of some organizations that currently have training in policy and diplomacy. Of course, the AAAS, the World Academy of Science. We have like region-specific training, such as the Inside SP, which is specific for Brazil and the Global South. We have NSPN, that I'm sure Bernard will talk a little bit more about that, the National Science Policy Network. So yeah, feel free, if you have any questions about how to apply to these programs, reach out to us and we'll make sure to answer your questions. Next slide, please. Also, leading and founding extracurriculars. I'm the founding member of Diplocientífica, which is the science diplomacy network in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm also part of the Puerto Rico Science Policy Action Network. For me, it's very important to give back to the community and to empower the next generation of scientists to contribute to policymaking. And I get to do that through these different voluntary organizations. Next slide, please. The Puerto Rico Science Policy Action Network is a network of scientists. It was funded in 2018. It has members, scientific, like all of us are scientists from Puerto Rico and the USA. And we focus on policy formulated based on scientific evidence. We do a lot of outreach, community engagement, science communication, especially during the pandemic. We were very active. Next slide, please. And the Science Diplomacy Network in Latin America and the Caribbean, or Diplocientífica, is a network and observatory for science diplomacy in the LAC region. We have more professionals. By that, like I think we're around 70 professionals right now from different LAC countries and professional areas. We have lawyers, we have scientists, we have educators, we have engineers, we have a little bit of everything. And we focus on communication between scientific and diplomatic communities, policymakers, academia, private sector, among others. Next slide, please. And I wanted to highlight, I love that we have a working group. We're constantly publishing articles, podcasts, all these things. Recently, we got a book chapter release as well. But I really wanted to highlight this white paper that we wrote, that it was recommendations for a science diplomacy strategy for safeguarding of the Amazon. You can, using the QR code there, you can access the document with the policy recommendations. This was a great exercise with different members from Diplocientífica. And we also had the opportunity of having like advisors, a committee of advisors to inform these policy recommendations that were, all of these advisors in the picture are experts in the region, especially in Brazil, in Colombia, and all the countries that are part of the Amazonas. And we have the opportunity of conducting an exercise just to get feedback from other scientists to inform the white paper at the SRI conference in Panama. This was last year. SRI stands for Sustainability Research and Innovation Conference. And some of us met for the first time in person after working for so many years. We never met in person until that time. So that was super fun. Next slide, please. And lastly, for me, it's very important to engage in science outreach and science communication. This is something that I constantly do. I think it's another full-time job of mine, but it's something that I really enjoy. And this was on steroids during the pandemic. This is just a sample of all the different speaking engagements that I had, most of them in Spanish. Just informing other Puerto Ricans and Latinos about the importance of vaccines, the immunology of the COVID-19 virus, and all these things. So I think during the pandemic, it gave me a purpose to have this kind of activities going on. And I think it's very important in order to engage in policy and diplomacy as well. Next slide, please. And lastly, just some take-home messages for you all. It's important. I know it's difficult with the current political climate and everything that is going on in the world, but I like to emphasize that we cannot be afraid as scientists. We have to use our knowledge to raise our voice and support evidence-informed policymaking. I think we have something to say. We have a lot to say, and we have to use our knowledge for that. Also, to use and leverage your networks to support science diplomacy. Don't burn bridges. That's very important. Most of these opportunities that I got through my career, and this is just a sample because I am mindful of the time, were through networking, right? The power of networking, who you know, who can help you. So it's very important to keep that in mind. Use your expertise and skills. Science is not just about being in the lab. I really don't like when they call soft skills, like communicating, all these things. For me, those are not soft skills. I think it's very important to be a good communicator. Policymakers and scientists are not gods. They're humans. So we have to communicate. We have to talk to each other. And that's very important, especially when you're talking to a high-level politician or whatever. Nobody's going to know more about your research than you. And it's very important to understand that and know how to communicate what has to be communicated in a very simple way. And science is not partisan, it's political. And we have to remember that always. It doesn't matter who's in office. And I think we cannot lose the perspective here. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. This is my contact info. You can scan the QR code and access all my networks. And thank you so much for the opportunity. And I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Luz. We do have just one question that we'll answer now or ask now. Are you okay with us sharing your slides after with the recording?
Sure. Yeah.
Great. So for everyone wondering, because I know we got a lot of questions about that, we will be sharing all the slides. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and I will stop sharing. But Brian, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Lexi. Thank you, AGU, for inviting me to talk to you today about science diplomacy. Before I jump in about science diplomacy and my way into it and some tips and all that, I want to first say, like, my background is not in the geosciences realm at all. My interest in particular is the tension between nature and nurture, so like genetics and the environment. And for me, that's what got me into science in the beginning. I would even say like where you grew up and how that impacted your emotions. That it's also for me a very nature versus nurture, childhood and development. Like that for me is really cool. So as you can guess, I'm a neuroscientist by training, and that's where I got my neuroscience degree at the University of Southern California. But really, my whole journey started before when I was around grad school, when I was kind of figuring out. I love talking about science. I love talking about the nature versus nurture tension. How can I take it further? And I think in terms of where that took me from where I was to now, I would say always look around you, look locally, look nationally, and look internationally. And what I mean by that is building off what Luz was talking about is that look towards what's going on around you at the university. If she mentioned earlier about, and I'm so glad you talked about it because I don't have to do as much talking about it. If there's a club, there is a science policy student network. Tap into that. I remember when I was in University of Southern California, there was a science policy group for Southern California. And we all hung out and gathered, we all networked together and provided advice, created events together, talked about sessions like science diplomacy and AI, or even science policy and AI. Actually, that's not true. We didn't have AI back then, but you get the idea. Look nationally, there are organizations that have something called Capitol Hill Day. Apply to those, get in on those opportunities because they're usually funded. They're looking for early career ambassadors, science policy ambassadors to come to Congress, tell them what's important about their research and why they need to fund research. Like these are great opportunities to help you with your scientific communication skills. There's also the Hellman Fellowship. There's also the Mirzayan from the National Academies, and there's also the AAAS. I'll also shift gears and talk about the international aspect. Look internationally. There is also EASA, which I don't know the acronym. I should know, and I really apologize if any EASA fans are out there. It's IIASA, Young Science Policy, YSP, Young Science Policy Fellows. And that's another opportunity, looking for graduate students to jump into that international realm and field. There's also the Fulbright Fellowship. Also think about that. Also look at the NSF GRFP. If you're really early into your career, GRFP stands for the Graduate Research Fellowship Program. There's a special career track that allows you to do research abroad. And that's also another opportunity. I'm just mentioning all these tools and tips and tricks because I think they are really helpful. They help gain the skill set that I need to get to where I am. For example, I'm linking it back to nature and nurture again because I feel like that really drives my like mantra, so to say. Like I've always entered the science policy, science diplomacy space thinking that nature is the system, the policy, the communities that we work with. And nurture is like our relationships that who we have to work with and the peoples and the international relationships that we have to hold every single day. And it's in between that we have to dance in the science diplomacy realm. So back then, what I did is when I got these fellowships, when I got the chance to travel and have these international collaborations, I played around that dance and tango in between the whole system, the nature, and the nurture. I will also thinking about skills wise, what the skills I developed. I'm really glad that Luz talked about the intercultural communication. I want to take that a step further, and I also want to say, but it's probably a synonym. Actually, no, it is a synonym. Cultural intelligence, and there's a book on that. If you want to look it up, cultural intelligence. It's a really great book to kind of provide you a holistic view of like where these things come into play, so you can be a little aware of when the time comes. Like for example, um, there was for example, let's say you're working with Asia, specifically East Asia. When you meet people, you typically want to, and you for the first time, you don't pass a business card with one hand, like, hey, here's my business card. You use two hands and you bow down a little bit to show a sign of respect. That is cultural intelligence and in play and in action. And where that came into key was when I was before I am where I am now at the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I was at the National Science Foundation, and then I was trying to develop a funding call on climate and health. These two are separate spheres within academia, and I would say even within all worldwide, actually, where the climate sphere and the climatologists and climate scientists don't really work with the medical researchers, right? And so we at NSF, we're thinking, how do we merge these two and have a global funding call? How do we bring on Asia to be part of this consortium, this global funding call? And for me to go there, I had to think about, okay, how do I make my first impression? Because first impressions matter. So hence business cards. And so I will stop there because I think it's a lot of things that are going on. But I wanted to say there's a lot of things you can do locally, nationally, and internationally. There's a ton of fellowships all around. There's a lot of skill sets you can look into, especially the career centers and even AGU. So tap into that. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sophie to introduce the next speaker.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. And next we'll have Bernat, and then we'll go into our moderated Q&A.
Awesome. Well, hi everyone. Thank you again for having me and allowing me to speak on these issues. My name is Ronat. I am a program officer at the National Academy of Sciences, working in the Science and Technology for Sustainability program within the Policy and Global Affairs division. And before I get into my current role, my background and you'll see some similarities with Brian and Luz. I think our careers haven't taken per se linear kind of pathway, and you get comfortable as you go and you embrace kind of these changes. But I am a biologist by training. I did my PhD on pancreatic cancer, and similarly, I think to Brian, I try to look for ways, within my university, of getting involved outside of the lab. Cancer research can be sometimes a little isolating because, maybe you don't have many contacts with patients. You're really kind of just working with cells, right? Like there's not, when I compare it to kind of environmental research or other types of research, you're really just in lab all the time. And so I started getting involved on policy in the student group, working on ways that we can increase diversity in clinical trials, which are important when you're thinking about new treatments and making sure that they work for all populations. And I will say, on this experience and things that Luz and Brian have mentioned, you may get a little overwhelmed about all of the things that we've saying that you can do or we did. And I feel like maybe when we joined policy and diplomacy, it was maybe 5 years ago. And now a lot more attention has been given to these opportunities and these fellowships and these. And I think one piece of advice that I think worked well with me is, really think about what motivates you and don't hesitate to tap into that, right? Like you're more than just your resume, you're more than just the fellowship that you want to do. I think each of us have a specific personal story or interest that really motivates you. So tap into it. Don't be afraid to say it, right? Like showcase the person that you are outside of the application that you're putting together. And I think that really will help you stand out when you're thinking about how these opportunities can help you in your career. But after after grad school, I think I took a different approach. I did a AAAS fellowship, but I was a congressional fellow. I saw a question in the chat about non-citizen. I'm happy to mention a little bit into that later on. I'm originally from Spain and have been was on a student visa for about 10 years, trying to make my way onto policy and diplomacy, which has its own challenges. But as a AAAS fellow in Congress, I was working for Senator Coons from Delaware. I was in his energy and environment portfolio. As you can see, quite a shift on focus, but I think was bringing my health background with me. And so, I embraced the chance to learn new topics. And my first, I had two main exposures to diplomacy from a congressional setting. So it's, I think, a little bit different than when you think about collaboration between universities or federal agencies. And I was speaking to those. The first one was on the work that the senator did with the U.S. Foundation for International Conservation, which was a bill to create a foundation within the Department of State to help support conservation programs internationally so that we have, they can be supported for more than 40 years, or they're not as impacted when there is a change in administration. And during that time, we met with different organizations or representatives from embassies from those countries that were interested in learning more, giving us, and us seeking that perspective. And I think that goes to Brian's point of that emotional kind of and cultural intelligence on how do you approach those conversations. I think it is just as important what you say as well as what you don't say and how you say it. Are you raising any red flags for them? Are you raising anything they should be concerned about? And I think it also diplomacy is a lot of trust, right? Are you a partner that they can trust? Are you a partner that you're going to listen to their concerns? Are you authentic? And so on those skills, they are the skills that you're learning all the time. I would say even just being in the room, listening how your boss or a coworker talks with those people, if you do not have that experience, that already you're already learning just by being there, listening, and really understanding the ways that you can communicate effectively with different diplomatic stakeholders. And then the second one was the Prove It Act, which was a study on carbon emissions of a lot of products such as steel or glass. And this kind of mimics a little bit or wants to get to a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a policy to kind of tax products that are very environmentally dirty compared to the environmental standards that a lot of countries are now putting in place. And so, as you can imagine, if the US wants to establish that, a lot of countries are very interested in knowing what's the approach. Am I going to be an ally to you? How can we work to harmonize these policies that we have? And so, had to also meet with a lot of embassies that were just interested in that maybe also didn't know how the political system works in the US. They thought this was already a law and it had just been introduced a week before. And so I think there is also that part of communication of really understanding how each country also works politically and the different nuances when approaching these issues. And so with that, then I transitioned, full-time as a program officer at the academies, working, as I said, on sustainability issues with also different partners, right? Not just experts in academic settings, but also embassies. Also, we have a program on scientists in exile and scientists and engineers exile in this place. So we help support scientists that are in areas of crisis that want to continue their profession, whether within the country of conflict or in nearby countries. And so all that to say, and I'll wrap up here, but I think diplomacy can really take different there's a lot of angles to diplomacy, right? And you can, as I said, do it in a nonprofit, you can do it in a scientific society, you can do it within your university, right? Think about the collaboration, international collaboration that are happening between scientists. Think about countries that have scientists that are nationals from that country all over the world, right? They are ambassadors in a way for those countries. And so if you're not from the US, talk to your embassy. They may be also interested in knowing what you're doing. Where are you doing it? What are your connections? Can there be connections between you and scientists that are in your country for collaboration, for speaking? And so I think, there are all these established fellowships or programs or opportunities, but I think don't be afraid to think a little bit outside of the box. There are many stakeholders in diplomacy, as I said, from universities to the UN to, the governments of each country. And so think where you want to be involved, in which level of that scale you want to be involved. If you don't know, that is totally okay. I think we're still learning. I think the three of us as we go. And so I think I'll leave it there, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions that attendees may have.
Great. Thank you all so much. That's amazing advice and insights, and we've been getting a lot of great engagement in the chat. So I will turn it over to Lexi to moderate the Q&A.
Perfect, and thank you all so much. And I would say, I think you've touched on elements of some of these questions, but I'm going to go through them because I think it's worth reiterating some points, and there's some additional, refinements to what you've already talked about. The first one you mentioned, you touched on a little bit, but are there fellowships for students interested in scientific diplomacy for non-US citizens? So I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on the non-US citizen piece of this work.
Yes, that is a little bit challenging. So I will say even policy or diplomacy, I think it does depend on which visa you're on. Happy to get into all the nitty-gritty of visas with whoever has a question, please. That's its own conversation. But I think there are opportunities, right? I think especially scientific societies are very open to supporting scientists. They may not be aware also about this nitty-gritty of can you work, can you not? And so there's a little bit of work that you have to do to know where you're at and what you can access and you cannot. But there are certainly opportunities. I did my AAAS fellowship sponsored by scientific society because I had an F1 visa and I could work. And then for diplomacy, I started recently the IAI fellowship that Lewis and Brian did. And so that's another opportunity that I was able to access through, not being a US citizen. And so I think there are opportunities. I think the nature of diplomacy work, depending where you do it, can be a little challenging because sometimes there are issues of national security. Sometimes there are issues of, can you represent a country if you're not a national from that country? And so there are certain, inherited and too political issues that put a barrier into that. But again, as I said, I think science diplomacy has many avenues. You can get engaged from different perspectives. And I think it's about finding those, getting experience there. And I think, that goes very, very, very far when it comes to you gaining skills, networking and really getting a better understanding of then future opportunities that maybe are not fellowships or are actually a job.
Thank you, Bernat. And Brian, yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've talked about it a lot when we work with other countries back when I was at NSF. But even now, I'll still say that I'm still thinking about it too as well. It's something that comes top of mind are the Marie Curie Fellowship if you're based in the EU or the European continents. I don't know whether it's available around the world as well. If you are in Asia, there is something called the Sakura Fellowships, which is based out of Japan and allows researchers to go to and from Japan. There's also, I think, there's other fellowships such as from GESDA, the Geneva Science, GESDA Science Anticipator, GESDA, that's another one. These acronyms, I'm sorry, I'm trying to break down these acronyms. There's also, I also want to emphasize that don't just think about fellowships that have dollar amounts. Think about them as networks as well. So one of them I would want to think about is GYA, Global Young Academy. It allows you to be in academia and also play that one in each foot in each place, for example. And there's probably more that I'm thinking of that I'm probably missing out. But I think maybe Luz has more thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I put some links on the chat. One of them is a very comprehensive list by the Johns Hopkins Science Policy Focus Group. That there are so many fellowships that I was even aware of, like research societies, private sector, you name it. Some of them are non-paid, like some of them is on a voluntary basis. So you have to have like an actual job, right? It's not like the AAAS fellowship that is like your job, right? So you have to, that's an important thing to consider as well. The IAI STEP fellowship is open for non-US citizens as well, which is the other fellowship that I say that I was homologous to the AAAS. There are some paid positions under that fellowship, and there are others that are not paid. Like, for example, in my case, I was not getting paid for that because it was a sub-fellowship appointment under the AAAS. Bernat just started as a fellow as well, and Brian was in that fellowship with me as well. But there are certain mechanisms that you can get into the fellowship and get paid for that. The Merseyran Fellowship is for 3 months, and that one is a paid opportunity. GESDA is for a week, I think. So it's important to take that into consideration, right? The length of the training that you're seeking. The National Science Policy Network has a great program that is like a 1-month boot camp. It's called the SciPol Scholars. And they have a science policy version and a science diplomacy version. And this program is unique because it allows you to do a 6-month externship once you're done with your training, paid, and they pay you for that. with a partner organization remotely. And that's how I got actually my previous job as a policy advisor at a government relations firm, because I was doing an internship with them after completing the training with NSPN. I'll put the link to those programs as well in the chat. But yes, there are so many things, so many different options and trainings.
That's fantastic. And thank you for all the resources and for the sharing in the chat and the Q&A as well. So many wonderful resources. And I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk somewhat about the career pathway itself. And there's sort of two questions related to that. One was kind of at what point in your PhD career did you sort of realize, okay, this was a pathway you wanted to take? And then one person asked, what does the post-fellowship pathway sort of look like? So kind of different stages along the career path. And again, opening it to everyone.
I'll jump in because I unmuted first. So for me, what got me made me realize that I loved being in the science policy realm was when I first heard about alternative careers in academia, and it was from and also a AAAS fellow saying, "Hey, this is what he did." For me, I was thinking I come from the neurosciences background, and I also from the wet lab side, and I was thinking to myself, what are some things that I could do post PhD, right? And one of the things is, of course, academia. The second one is thinking about biotech and startups. For me, these two things aren't for me. I love research, I love science, but I can't see myself doing it all the time. I realized that for me, I've also loved being part of these student government organizations and student groups and I always had a voice in something. And also having a chance to represent my fellow cohort students when I was a grad student. That kind of just made me realize even more. But I think the thing that was a catalyst for me was when I was listening to this AAAS fellow, and he was telling me one day he was at the bench, and the next day, once he got the official approval from the AAAS that he is now a fellow at the State Department, he went from lab bench studying HIV to talking about nuclear discussions with Russia and managing the chikungunya virus and outbreak in the Caribbean. And I was like, that is cool. And that is something that I would love to be a part of, and talking with other countries and dealing with that logistics and coordination and all that. Because I think that's taking the real policy end of things and making sure the path that you choose down the middle, it works for both countries. And it aligns with both of the current systems that are in play. What does the post-fellowship look like for me afterwards? When I was at the NSF, I did a lot of grants and grant coordination and grant creation and building and connections with other NSF-like agencies from around the world. Afterwards, what's afterwards is trying that same skill set of thinking, what are the key skill, the needs for one partner or the US versus another partner, and try to find a balance and agreement between those two. And it's the same skill set that I used when I was at NSF is the same skill set that I'm using now at USGCRP, US Global Change Research Program. It's very much the same, different skill set, different or same skill set, more responsibility. Other than that, it's pretty exciting because I'm building and learning every single day.
That's fantastic. Banana, yes.
So in my case, I always knew that I didn't want to stay in academia. But I had several friends and mentors that are alumni of the fellowship, or the AAAS fellowship. And I saw all the cool stuff that they were doing with their degrees, right? Like, I had no idea that you could do so many cool things because before you always think, okay, yeah, I will open my own lab, and that's what I'm going to do. And I try to be strategic since very early on in my career, especially during my grad school years, to take courses, to participate in leadership programs. to attend conferences such as the AAAS. I highly recommend you attending. It's my favorite meeting. NSPN meeting, the National Science Policy Network annual meeting, in building the network. And I think that was the power of networking. And I'm going to keep emphasizing on that, how one opportunity led me to the other, and all that, like a chain reaction. And so yeah, those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I will. I'll keep it brief. But I similar, I think, to Brian. I think I realized a little later on. I was like, do I want to continue in academia? Do I want to do industry? I think there were 2 things that motivated me to do the jump. I think the first one was, do I like working in a very narrow, very tiny little detail of pancreatic cancer, right? Like, do I want to do these for 50 years? Not that I could, I could change, right? But like the nature of a PhD is very specific. And I always found myself kind of thinking of other issues outside of my research. And I didn't really care, right? It could be housing, it could be environment, it could be health, it could be, I always felt like I had a lot of opinions about a lot of things, even if I didn't know, all the details of everything. But I think that idea of like, I don't mind being a generalist for at least a while, and like, I actually enjoy it, and I like to feel comfortable, or like I feel comfortable sometimes talking about things that I learned 2 weeks ago. I think that was a fun part of that transition of just like, embracing that everyone's an expert because you've talked about it for 2 weeks, right? And there's a certain like freedom to it that I found it quite fascinating in the Hill. And I think the other one was that part of, what Luz said about science being political. I think I really wanted to tap into that. And I feel like there were certain constraints doing it in academia. I felt like I wanted to just tap into politics. And with that, I'll mention 2 things, right? The one of them is, not everyone will take science as that thing that matters the most. A lot of people prioritize many other things. And so I think, part of my advice is, don't get discouraged of like, if people don't really care about the science or just see it as a one extra pillar and not the main pillar. I think you have to manage the expectations that other people have on science. And echo also Lou's point of networking, right? And your post fellowship or whatever you do next step really kind of gets influence on that, right? Like opportunities that other people may flag for you, but also they can talk about. I feel like if people go on LinkedIn, they find someone that has a cool title and they want to learn more, email them, send them a message. Like, you will be surprised about, the willingness that people have to just talk to you for 30 minutes, invite them for coffee, do a virtual call, right? Get to the point, don't waste their time. But I think people are very open to talk about their jobs, about the career path, and about giving you tips. And so I feel like if you want to learn more about a position, about a fellowship, just reach out to them, because they were in your positions not that many years ago. And so they've really learned about what they, about their careers, and they can then point you to other people, right? So this is a chance to then meet people from that initial first connection. And so you can start growing your network that way.
That's great. And it actually, just to kind of expand on this a little bit. So one of the questions we got was for science policy experience. How do you prepare for work that's outside your specific research expertise? You talked a little bit about switching fields, right? And this whole like, oh, I'm an expert after 2 weeks, but for scientists, that could be very uncomfortable. So what would you say to that?
I think, at least my experience has been, you obviously, I still do it, right? I like to read, I like to know about the issue, but you kind of end up putting, especially if you have deadlines, if you have things that you have to get done, there is a certain line that you will put to yourself, right? Have I learned enough about this issue? Can I talk about it with someone? And And I think a lot of the other part is that a lot of, I think, policy and diplomacy job is talking to the people who know those details, and that you end up learning by connecting to people who are doing their PhD or that work full time on that issue, right? And so I think you get more comfortable switching gears and switching topics because you're constantly learning about it. And I think that's what made it less daunting, is that everyone is willing to talk to you about what they do and to really give you the answers that you may not have. And so, again, stakeholder engagement and network and a lot of it is, again, it's connections with people and getting to a common goal. And so I think that makes it slightly easier. It's that ability to have that information and to learn from people who are really the experts.
Luz?
Yeah, I echo that. I deal with a lot of things that I have no idea. I mean, especially in this office, the biggest portfolios are border migration issues, security issues. And I've been learning from colleagues. And I think the most important part are your analytical skills, not necessarily your expertise per se. Here, they're interested in your ability to critically think, to analyze data. Those are the interpret data, right? Those are the kind of skills that they're looking for here as an advisor, as a policy advisor. Not necessarily, it's great if you have expertise in something, but normally our thesis work and our expertise is so niche, is so like specific that I can count with one hand the amount of times that I've used like my specific expertise for something. And I think it's just teamwork, relying on others, asking questions, and just using your general skills as a scientist, as a communicator to inform policymaking. But I think that scientific expertise is not as relevant, honestly. Some people don't even care about that, to be honest. So, yeah.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to add anything?
I can add a few things. I totally agree with their mentioning, both Luz and Bernard's talking about, like, analytical skills are 100% like more important. I will say something. One thing that I think most people are familiar with from the lab, you already have the skills. Technically, actually, not even technically, you have the skills, because I'm going to give you an example. Let's say in a lab, you work in a wet lab, you have some reagents that come into the lab. That need to be preserved at a certain temperature or whatnot. That maybe once in a while they may be left out too long and then it's no longer as good. So you keep a stock to yourself because how the quality of this item is going to be maintained, and yourself, right? All these things. That's called risk management, because you can prepare for a future error or a mistake or a situation by thinking ahead of time and planning ahead of time. Risk management, that's something that you already do, that you think about and you already work in that space. Another example is developing collaboration with another partner abroad, or even across a department, right? These are it's making sure you maintain a relationship, making sure that you're able to communicate with someone with compassion, delivering on items that they need. That's something that you already are working on. And I'll also think about one more thing. One more thing I want to mention is that I don't think your skill set matters or your background matters significantly. Analytical skills matter more. And I'll give you an example on that. I come from the neurosciences background. I do imaging with like mouse brains and human brains a lot. I think that's very similar to Earth observations. A satellite takes a photo of let's say, an area of land, and that image needs to be validated on the ground. In a lab setting, if I take a photo of a mouse brain using a microscope, I also need to validate that using multiple ways just within the mouse brain as well. And I would say thinking about those techniques and that skill set can be easily transferred, picked up, and plopped in to an Earth observations background in a sense. So analytical skills matter one last thing I'll say is be humble. You're always there to learn. Go in there with an open mind and be excited.
I will also note, so, and it touches on another question here, but it's the ways in which some of the skill sets are similar, not only across disciplines, but, so AGU has been growing into the global policy space. We have a lot of history in the US policy space. One of the questions is suggestions on where and how to receive training in home diplomatic communication skills. One of the things that really strikes me was how similar the skill sets are just in terms of good communication practices, good analytical practices, and so forth. And so just a tiny plug that AGU does a lot of science communication training. We have materials on our web, we have our own programs, and it seems to me that those would be directly relevant, whether it's US policy or global policy. But I also want to open it up to the group. And I think this might be our last question, and my apologies we didn't get to everyone in the chat. Oh, anyone else want to talk about, the best places that you know of for the communication skills, like where you got your communication skills or what you would recommend?
So all these links that we post on the chat, apply. NSBN, AAAS, the World Academy of Science, AGU, all these are great resources to learn more about science communication, diplomacy, and policy. All the things that are in the chat. And I saw another question, volunteer organizations you mentioned, if they're open to new members. They normally have an open call. So if you want, just follow Diplocientífica on social media, and they normally post a call there.
Yeah, the only thing that I agreed with Louis, I think also feel free to do new things, right? Like I started a podcast because I had some friends and we wanted to talk about science and talk about issues, and we did that, and that was a different other skill, right? And so I think as I said, do things that interest you, do things that make you motivated. You don't want to gain skills because you feel like you have to, and then you're not really enjoying what you're doing, but you feel like you have to be a good communicator. That it's okay, right? There's people who are introverted, extroverted, there are people who are going to enjoy talking more or less. I think it's a thing that you're going to practice all your life, right? And get better. It's going to change depending on the work that you're doing. And that's where I'll end it. It's kind of think about what you want to do, where you want to do it. I think that really influences a lot because, policy issues and diplomatic issues are always going to be changing, right? We've seen it in the past 4 years, right? Things can really take a turn very fast. But I really think people who work with you probably are not going to change during the time that you're going to be there. And so really think about where you want to be working, with whom you want to be working, because those environments really are going to impact the quality of your work and how how much you're going to enjoy what you're doing.
Thank you so much. And Brian, my apologies. We need a minute to wrap up there, but I really thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of our attendees. Sophie, you want to take us home?
Yes, I will reshare my screen just for one moment. And I want to say a really big thank you to everyone who attended today for all the great engagement, all the great questions. And then a huge thank you for our panelists for taking the time to be here today and answering all of our questions. We really appreciate all the advice and the insights that you have given our attendees. There's been so many amazing sound bites on how to get involved in science diplomacy and just hone your skills. So we really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed this session and want more, here's some information on the next webinar in our Global Policy webinar series, which is preparing for COP29. And you can also find a recording of our previous session. The latest one was on how to write a policy brief. And you can scan the QR code to see the full list and register for our next webinar. Sorry. And then if you have any unanswered questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. You can also sign up for AGU's Science Policy Alert emails to stay informed on science policy happenings and also find our various programs. We also have a lot of skills building programs and ways for scientists to come and talk on the Hill, as well as we'll send you all of the great resources that were in the chat too from our panelists when we send out this recording. And we'd love to hear any feedback that you have on this session and learn about what topics you would like to see in our webinar series. So there will be a brief survey when you sign off at the end. Thank you so much in advance for filling that out. And again, thank you to our panelists and all of our attendees. And we hope to see everyone at our next webinar. Have a great rest of your day.